And one last thing on the polygraph test, that this is the only acceptable honesty test that employers can use. So there is not a loophole in this law that an employer can say, oh, I'm going to use some other type of monitoring truthfulness telling test other than polygraph and get around this law. If an employer qualifies under this law to use a polygraph test, they can. If they don't, then they cannot use a polygraph test. Like I said, they can use the pen or paper types of tests, but they cannot use any other honesty tests. So this is the only one. And if you look up the Employee Polygraph Protection Act, you can get a lot more detail on it. You're not responsible for it for this class, but there are obviously a lot more details to how it can be used in employment of those employers and employees that it can be used for. Okay. So drug tests. So we actually were talking a bit about this in class already, but want to follow up because this is where it comes up in the material. Drug tests are very common and there are limits on it. It's not to say that everybody follows the law regarding it. Generally, pre-employment drug testing is upheld if it is reasonably and consistently applied. So again, you do not have to give it to every applicant or require every applicant to take a drug test, but once the employer narrows down the applicant pool or actually goes to make an offer, then they can require it. But what they cannot do is have it required of some new employees or some new applicants, but not others, if they're at the same process in their hiring and same point in the hiring process. Additionally, employer has to protect confidentiality results. So it is very important that the employer guards those types of results. Typically, details of those should not be put. Any medical records types of details generally should not be in the employee's regular personnel file. It should be in a different file because a lot of people might rightfully have access to the personnel file, but they don't rightfully have access to that information. So pre-employment testing. So if employers want to do some sort of drug testing to try to keep those issues out of the workplace and not have to deal with them later, pre-employment is the best way. Periodic or random drug testing during employment is generally not upheld. And so most of the jobs you're going to be working in, office jobs, no, not going to be upheld. It can be if it is a safety reason. So what you will find sometimes if they're handling in charge of heavy machinery or dealing with invasive, potentially invasive procedures of patients, those types of things, in the medical field or whatever, it may be allowed. But again, it can be sort of a tricky area. If there are other regulations, like in the transportation industry, that allow drug testing, then of course, then it would be allowed pursuant to those regulations. Similarly, post-accident drug testing is generally upheld in transportation or safety-sensitive positions. So, police officer involved shooting, those types of things. Usually drug testing is part of that, and that has usually not been a problem. So in certain areas it is definitely allowed. And if you want to know more on, especially with transportation, the Department of Transportation has regulations, and there's a list of agencies who have implemented. And so it's mentioned in the textbook. You could certainly go to the regulations. You're not responsible for our purposes, but it's just important to understand the limitations on drug testing. And as we talked about in class already, if an employer is acting inconsistently with the law regarding drug tests of current employees, the difficulty is until someone challenges it, the employer is probably going to keep on doing it because some employers will feel they have a vested interest and it's worth it to them. And if you are a current employee, are you going to challenge it if you want to keep your job? You could challenge it, refuse, be fired, then file a lawsuit, but that doesn't help you in the moment when you're trying to keep your job and support yourself and your family. So with a lot of what we've talked about, that sometimes is a practical issue. So even though it legally might not be allowed, it practically may be done and deemed to be accepted, even though it may not be consistent with the law. So that is the drug testing. Then other medical testing, you generally, as we've already talked about, employers are not allowed to inquire into somebody's health or medical history, or conditions or medications or anything along those lines. Now, obviously, there are some exceptions, depending on the position. If you are, usually if you're a bus driver or an airplane pilot or something like that, because of the safety issues, then more information may need to be disclosed. But generally, employers are not legally allowed to inquire into that information and generally cannot require employees to take medical tests as pre-employment or during employment. Again, there are exceptions. A lot of times, high-level management personnel, CEOs, presidents, those types of positions, sometimes as part of their employment, they have to have regular medical exams for life insurance purposes, because the company can suffer if they leave the position very quickly due to death or medical situation. So there are some exceptions, but generally not allowed. Again, we've already talked about the ADA and the fact that if an employee is requesting a reasonable accommodation, they have to provide appropriate medical documentation for that. Same thing with Family Medical and Leave Act, which we will be talking about later. If an employee needs to take that leave, they do have to provide appropriate documentation that that leave is necessary. So there's always some exceptions, but the general rules are pretty broad. And then psychological testing, this doesn't happen very often, but if it is, it's usually only done after the offer of employment has been made. If the employer tries to do it before the offer has been made, they could meet with some legal issues based on that. But again, usually the psychological testing is more high-level management types of positions where they're trying to find the best fit for the company. So not your typical day-to-day. Usually pre-employment testing, you're dealing with tests that in theory measure somebody's skills or qualifications to do the job, or the pre-employment drug testing that tends to be the main ones that we see.